Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio. I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University. Today, the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project is very happy to host Professor Franklin Perkins and his talk on Doing What You Really Want, which deals with the Mengzi Mencius. We also want to thank Professor Li Ting-Mien for chairing this session, and Professors Ping-Ju and Jiang for providing initial comments. And I'd like to remind everyone that there will be an additional discussion session at the same time next week. So I'll put the Zoom link in the chat, and you can also find it on the website with the details of this talk. The 四海为学 project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we're not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism and self-promoting. We also hope to curb other types of aggressive and "look, I'm smarter than you" types of attitudes in academic exchanges. 四海为学 hopes to accomplish this change in academic orientation by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, with real questions, real responses, and generally collaborative learning together. And I think this group of people in particular is really a great group of people to exemplify this. So as many of us know all too well from experience, miscommunication or missed communication can have disastrous results, from ordering the wrong food to starting wars. With the goal of fostering real, honest, humble exchange and open communication, 四海为学 encourages unselfish, anti-egoist, don't be a jerk, and let's actually try to learn together. So here, there's a little bit less of an emphasis on learning about Chinese philosophy, and the focus is more on learning from Chinese philosophy. And from what I take, Frank, and again, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but I think that's really a lot of what you do in your new book. And it seems like this from the PowerPoint. So that's perfect for what our goals are with 四海为学. So without further ado, I hand the talk over to Professor Li Ting-Mien.
Okay, thank you. It's my great pleasure and pressure to be the moderator of the 7th lecture of Collaborative Learning Project. Our speaker today is Professor Franklin Perkins, a professor of the Department of Philosophy at University of Hawaii at Manoa. His areas of specialization include classical Chinese philosophy, early modern European philosophy, and comparative philosophy. Professor Perkins is a very prolific scholar. Aside from many articles, he is also the author of Number 1, Heaven and Earth Are Not Human, The Problems of Evil in Classical Chinese Philosophy, and Leibniz, A Guide for the Perplexed, and Leibniz and China, Commands of Lights, and he is also a co-editor of Chinese Metaphysics and Problems and Its Problems. His books has been translated into several languages such as Portuguese, Japanese, and Chinese. Professor Perkins, as many of you have already known, is also the editor of the highly prestigious journal Philosophy East and West. The title of his lecture today is Doing What You Really Want, 孟子 on Motivation. We are very much looking forward to your lecture, Professor Perkins. You have about 30 to 60 minutes. The floor is yours now, please.
All right. Thank you, Li Ting-Mien, for chairing this session. And thank you, Paul, for inviting me, and Tao and Ping-Ju, thanks for commenting. And thank you all for coming. I see names of people that I really miss seeing in person. So I wish we could meet up in person again before too long. I'm going to try to share my screen. I don't have a lot of slides, but it will make it a little easier to see. And somehow I haven't used Zoom in a while, and it's not looking like it used to. Does that everybody see my screen now?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. All right. So the title of the talk really is, based straight out of the title of the book. And I thought I'll say a little bit about the motivation behind the book and then how that relates to the motivation behind this talk, which fits a lot with what Paul was saying in the introduction. Yeah, and then I'll present what I take to be sort of the key idea that I want to take out of the Mengzi. So this book, I found it stressful to publish it and to have people read it, unlike other things that I've written, because I really am advocating a philosophy in this. And philosophers usually do that, but I don't usually do that in my writing, right? I usually kind of just explore ideas. I don't really advocate something. And this book is clearly advocating a certain version of Mengzi's philosophy. And that goes to the origin of the book. So I wrote the original draft actually 20 years ago in a very short time. And it was written in a very specific context. So I'd been meeting a lot of people that I would label as activists. So some of them were in kind of service-oriented NGOs, and then a lot of them were around protesting, trying to stop the second Iraq war. So it was around that time. And a lot of them were, their activism was grounded in religion. So for a lot of them, it was Christians, some kind of liberal Christian tradition usually. But then there were ones who were more like me, disillusioned with Christianity, and they were interested in Asian thought, but all you really like encounter popularly is Taoism and Buddhism, and those aren't really, not very clearly linking up to an activist philosophy, right? If not actually opposed to an activist philosophy. So meeting these people, I thought, and I told some people, like, you really should look at Confucianism. Like, that's really a thoroughgoing activist philosophy. But then I thought, what am I going to tell people to read Mengzi? Like, that Mengzi will come off as boring and you won't be able to see what's interesting in it. And there wasn't really anything for people to read, even as just a kind of non-specialist introduction to Mengzi, let alone focused on this issue of activism. And so things fell together that I had a summer in Berlin that was free because I'd finished the thing I actually got the grant for, and I was totally isolated. And I just, like, in a quick time wrote a draft of this book. So it was written very much specifically for certain people to say, look, I think this vision of life will be useful for you, right? That was the original spirit behind it. And in fact, it was called Confucianism and Activism until it went out for review at Oxford University Press. And one of the reviewers kind of nixed that title, I think for the better, but that's what it was called until just my folder in my computer is still called Confucianism and Activism. There's another side of it, though, which is really since college, I would say, since I first read Mengzi and Zhuangzi, I've thought those were the two most plausible philosophies for life for me. And I've really alternated back and forth between them my whole life since then. And really, I mean, honestly, I think if you're committed to a naturalistic view of the world, I think that those are the two best philosophies. Like, I think those are the two best alternatives. I think they're both far superior to Aristotle. I think they're better than the Stoics. Buddhism is a good competitor, but even there, I think without reincarnation, it's a weaker position. So I really feel like these are the two best philosophies. And I really have alternated between them. I wrote the original draft of the book when I was very much in a Mencian phase, right? And a more activist phase. Rewriting it, I've rewritten it a number of times over the course of the last 20 years, but I've been much more often not in a Mencian phase, more in a Zhuangzian phase. And the book is written in some ways to convince myself, like I'm partly like arguing with myself, I think, convincing myself of this position as I was writing it. And I'll say the key question, and I really think it should be a key question of philosophical ethics, and I think it would be if we weren't so Eurocentric in our focus. I think a key question of ethics, the key question for me personally has always been, should I care more or should I care less? Mengzi is clearly on the side of saying you should care more. I think Zhuangzi is clearly on the side of saying you should care less. And I go back and forth between these depending on my life circumstances, on various other factors, right? And so this book is definitely on the Mengzi side. It wouldn't be surprising if I write one that's doing the Zhuangzi side before too long, right? So what I want to do with this talk, in kind of the spirit of the way I wrote it, is I'll lay out my account of Mengzi's account of motivation, which I really think is the core of what's valuable out of Mengzi. And then just very frankly look at criticisms of it. What are the problems with it? What are the weaknesses of it? Why am I not settled on it? And then the conclusion, I want to look at a kind of meta level, reflect on how Mengzi's argument is supposed to even work. Like what kind of argument is it? Is it really a philosophical argument? Like what's going on with his argument? So that's what I want to conclude with. I'm aiming to talk for 40, 45 minutes, something like that. Okay, so I want to start with what I think could arguably be the most important passage in the whole Mengzi. So Mengzi said, fish is what I desire, bear paw is also what I desire. If these two cannot be both attained together, I abandon the fish and take the bear paw. Life is what I desire, rightness also is what I desire. If these two cannot be attained together, I abandon life and take rightness. Life is what I desire, but what I desire is something deeper than life. Thus I will not do crooked things to attain life. Death is what I hate, but what I hate has something deeper than death. Thus there are things I will not do to avoid harm. So in this, the start of the passage, right, Mengzi is only talking about his own personal preferences, right? He's not making any broader claim about what other people think. He's just talking about himself. And I'll come back to analyze what I think is interesting about it or significant about it. But for now, I just want to point out one key thing, which is that he clearly here is saying that he wants to live, and not just that he wants to live, but that he wants to eat fancy good foods, right? So he's clearly saying like, these are all good things and these are all things that he wants. And in an ideal world, you would have all of those, right? So he'd be, you know, a sage who lives a long life and is like getting fat, eating fish and bear paw. Like that's what he wants. That's the life that he wants. And if things were just, you might say that would be the way it should work. The people who are good should get the other things that they want. And say for the Moists, that's what they always argue, right? That as Mozi says, if I do what Tien wants, Tien will do what I want, right? What does Tien want? Tien wants me to practice Yi. What do I want? I basically want a good position and a salary. Mengzi has a much more tragic view, right? So he wants all these things, he wants all of them together, but circumstances are such that sometimes you have to pick between them, right? So you go to a restaurant, it's a Western style restaurant, you got to pick one dish that you're going to eat. You want fish and bear paw, but you got to pick one, and you pick the one that you want the most, right? You want to live, you want to do the right thing. Sometimes these clash and you have to choose between them. And Mengzi says, do the thing you want the most, right? Or he says he does the thing he wants the most. And what he wants the most is to do the right thing, even if that means dying. So this is a claim about him, but the next step of the passage goes on to make a claim about everyone, right? He says, if in what people desire, there was nothing greater than life, then if there were anything they could do to attain life, they would use it. If in what people hate, there were nothing greater than death, then if there were anything they could do to avoid death, they would do it. Yet there are cases in which one could live, but some means are not used, or one could avoid death, but some things are not done. Thus, having what one desires more than life, and having what one hates more than death, it's not only worthies that have this heart, all people have it. Worthies are able to not lose it. So I think the important point that Mengzi is trying to make in this statement is really just that people have certain values that are deeper than their own life and their own comfort and their own pleasure. Right? I think that's the core point that he wants to make. He makes it in a particularly strong form, though, to say there are certain things that people would refuse to do, even if refusing to do them meant that you would die. Right? Now, we could imagine a stronger claim. So I think it's a slightly weaker claim that he makes than to say we would actively go out and sacrifice our life for certain things. So I feel like that's harder for me to imagine doing than to imagine some circumstance where I said, no, like, I just can't do that. And yeah, okay, I'm going to die, right? So I think the way he formulates it, we should attend to that, right? The strength of it. It is a stronger claim, though, than just to say, you know, there are certain things people risk their life for, because if we risk our life, we at least like have the hope that we're going to survive it, right? We don't know that we're going to die. A more minimal claim that would still make Mengzi's basic point is to think of cases where we willingly sacrifice our own comfort and, say, sensory pleasures. So I think there are tons of cases like that for anyone, right? So the most obvious ones are things we do for friends, where I would say, you know, I don't know, helping my friend move. That's what I actually want, because I care about my friend, and I care about my friend more than having the day free to go to the beach, right? But still, like, all things considered, I would rather just go to the beach, right? Not all things considered in isolation, right? My own pleasure, my own enjoyment would be to say, just go to the beach. So out of this claim that Mengzi is making, I think we could kind of ask two questions about it. One would be, you know, is he right? And I don't see how to evaluate that claim. So he's certainly right about some people. Like, there are people who do that, right? And I mean, I gave a talk on this a couple of months ago, and it was right after, I think it was a orchestra leader in Ukraine was sort of ordered to perform for some, pro-Russia celebration and refused, and he was shot, right? So there are lots of examples of people who fit Meng's claim here. There are, I think, examples of the opposite as well, right? People who would pretty much do anything to stay alive. For Meng's, I think the question would be, what would most people do? But there's no way to test that, right? Too few people end up in that circumstance. So I don't really how we would evaluate his claim here. The second thing we could think about would be what would be some plausible examples of such values? Like what would be things that people would refuse to do even facing death? And Meng's does give us some examples of that. So the actual example he gives in this passage is one that I find somewhat less convincing. So he says, one basket of food, one cup of stew. If one attains them, then they live, but if they do not attain them, then they die. If the giver sneers angrily and gives it, then a wanderer on the road will not receive it. If one tramples on it and gives it, then a beggar will consider it unworthy. So this, honestly, like if I try to look at my own thinking, I kind of think I would take the food in that circumstance. Like this example doesn't really speak to me. I think I could rationalize taking the food. Maybe other people would disagree on what their feelings about it would be. Maybe it would depend on exactly what was happening. I do think Meng's basic point is right, that one of the things we would sacrifice kind of our material benefits for or our pleasure for is to avoid being humiliated, right? We might say we have a kind of, we value our dignity, something like that. I think that's what he has in mind here. He does note here that even though he thinks a beggar would do this, and I think his point is that he thinks most people would choose death in that circumstance. In day-to-day life, we end up doing similarly bad or similarly humiliating things for much more trivial results, right? So for having a beautiful palace, having wives and concubines, having a reputation with people, right? So he is here recognizing that there's a kind of contradiction. And I'll just note, I think for Meng's philosophy, one of the things I think he's most concerned with is the point that appears here, that he does think, in desperate circumstances, people will really sacrifice for other people. And yet in day-to-day life, they won't. And that seems inherently contradictory, right? And so I think one of his main questions is like, how do we understand that? Of course, he wants to think, how do we stop that from happening, right? How do we keep people from doing that? That's not the theme of my talk, but I do think that's one of the main things Meng's is frustrated with, right? Trying to sort out, like, why are we not so good, given that in desperate circumstances we will make those kinds of sacrifices. A more persuasive example, I think, appears in 6b1, and I didn't give you the beginning of the passage, so I'll just summarize it because the context actually does matter. So it starts out with someone really trying to raise problems for a disciple of Meng's named Wu Luzi. And he says to Wu Luzi, what's more important, eating or ritual? Propriety, right? Li. And Wu Luzi, of course, says Li is more important. And he says, what about sex? Like, how does sex compare with Li? And Wu Luzi says, of course, like Li is more important. So then the guy says, well, imagine a circumstance where you're like actually starving to death. And there's some food you could eat, and you'll survive. But eating it's going to involve some violations of, let's say, like table manners, some violation of etiquette. Do you really have to just die there? And he says, okay, imagine a circumstance where, you have like one shot at getting married, which for them would be like having sex and having children. But doing it's going to require like not following the proper marriage ceremony. Do you really have to like resign yourself to a life of celibacy there? And Wu Luzi, on the one hand, I think he recognizes that's just stupid. Like, no, like, of course you don't do that there. But he has just said that ritual propriety is more important than eating and sex. So he doesn't know what to say. He goes to Meng's and says, okay, like, what should I say in this circumstance? And Meng's scolds him, saying, like, come on, like, this is easy to deal with. And Meng's says this. He says, gold is heavier than feathers, but that doesn't refer to a gold clasp and a cartload of feathers. If you take the weightiest of eating and the slightest of ritual and compare them, of course, eating is weightier. If you take the weightiest of sex and the slightest of ritual and compare them, then of course, sex is weightier. Go and respond to him by saying, if by twisting your older brother's arm and taking his food, you can get food to eat. But if you do not twist his arm, then you cannot attain food. Will you then twist his arm? If by leaping over the eastern wall of a neighbor and dragging off their virgin daughter, then you can attain a wife. But if you do not drag her off, then you cannot attain a wife. Will you then drag her off? So I think this passage is important in relation to 6a10 for two reasons. So one is, I think in all of Meng's examples, the most persuasive one to me for his case in 6a10, right? So, we don't know what we would really do, but I feel like if the only way for me to stay alive was essentially to kill my sister, I don't think I would do it. Again, you don't know for sure what you would do in a circumstance like that, but I really don't think that I would do it. I think I would just accept death in that case. And that's the example Meng's is giving here. The second one's different because it's not a matter of death, right? But it seems like equally one where it would be like, no, like you just wouldn't do that, right? Now, Meng's recognizes that some people would, people do things like that, right? But his claim here is about what, let's say, regular people would do. Maybe the claim really is about what you would do, right? I think that's really ultimately how his argument's working, and I'll say more about that later. The other important thing out of this that should influence 6a10 is that Meng is here saying that there can be a genuine trade-off between the desire to live and rightness, right? So 6a10 might sound totally absolute, like any issue of rightness, if it's going to require you to die, you still have to do it. Meng's here saying like, no, that's just silly. Right. Of course, there are cases where you can compromise your values for the sake of staying alive. And probably there's cases where you can compromise your values in order to eat fish and bear paw. Right. His point is like at the extremes, right, we choose the rightness over life, right? Not that there can't be any compromise or trade-off between them. So we just think about like filling in again, what are the values? Of course, the key thing would be 2a6 and the version of it in 6a6. So this isn't about what you would die for, right? It's about the things people naturally care about. So the famous story of people seeing a child about to fall into a well, spontaneously having this feeling of kind of panicked concern, right? Not for any ulterior motive, but just naturally having this feeling. He then tries to systematize these motivations under the Siduan, right? So we have feeling of compassion, concern. We have feelings of shame, feelings of aversion. I think probably we could take aversion there as feelings of disgust, right, which are often connected to ethics in certain ways. Declining and yielding in 6a6, he describes that more as showing respect, desiring to show respect. And then the heart of affirming and denying is complicated. I'll leave that out for now, but it's something like trying to understand things, I think is what he's talking about. People put a lot of weight on this, but I think it's Meng's attempt to give a kind of generalization of our values, and I think it's not meant to be a kind of exhaustive account. And in fact, a lot of things he says elsewhere in the text, it's not exactly clear where they would fit in here. So not being willing to kidnap your neighbor's daughter, I guess, is the feeling of aversion probably that would fall under, right? But I think here he's trying to give an account of what kind of generalization about what these basic motivations are. So from what I've shown so far, we can get a take on what he means when he says our Xing is good, right? Xing Shan, the natural dispositions are good. So one claim, the more minimal claim, is that we naturally have good, we might say pro-social motivations that form the basis of the virtues. So he's also admitting, even in himself, right, that we have desires for sensory pleasures, we have desires for life, we have competing desires, right? But those aren't all we have, right? We're not just selfish. We have these other, I would say broadly say, good motivations. The second claim is stronger though, right? So not just that we have good motivations and bad motivations, or at least say like neutral motivations, but that these good motivations naturally outweigh our other motivations. So he's very clear in saying they don't always outweigh them, and they even shouldn't always outweigh them, right? He's saying in 6b1. But when pushed to extremes, which for him, the extreme is facing death, right? My dying is the end of my chance of any kind of sensory pleasure. So when pushed to that extreme, he thinks these good motivations naturally do outweigh these other motivations. And so this, I think, gives a real content to his claim that our dispositions are good. It's not just that some of our dispositions are good, but that those also naturally dominate, right? And that I think is the key to his claim. That idea that they naturally dominate, though, is really not made much in the Meng's. Like, it's really clearest in 6a10, but not as clear in other places. Okay, let me now kind of move toward the significance about this. Because I think the significance, in a way, is partly how he's framing the whole question of being good. So the first key point is that he's not opposing what we should do to what we want to do. So we often think of ethics and morality in exactly those terms. Like that's why it's difficult to be good, is because it requires doing what we should do instead of what we want to do. Ideally for Mengzi, right, we just do what we want to do, and that's being virtuous. I think he would have to admit, although he rarely does admit it, I'm not sure he ever admits it, I think he would have to admit that, yes, sometimes if you're not cultivated enough, you have to do what you should do instead of what you want to do. But his approach is really always to try to find something you want to do that's good, and then link that to this thing that you should do. Like that's pretty consistently his approach, is to say, not like you should override your desires and do this thing, but that you should look at your desires and see how this thing actually aligns with these desires that you already have, right? He's pretty consistent on that. It follows from that, I think, that he's rejecting a dichotomy between selfishness and altruism. And in fact, reject is too strong. He's not framing it in those terms at all, right? He's not rejecting it. He's not even thinking of it enough to reject it. But this is a common response I get from students when I'm teaching Mengzi, is to say, well, if I really, like, I'm always just doing what I want, isn't that just selfish, right? And I think Mengzi would think the question was weird, but I think if he understood the question, he might agree. I mean, he's definitely against thinking of an ideal life as one that depends on self-denial, right? Like he's strongly opposed to that kind of view. You should be, authentically yourself and like invested in yourself, invested in your desires. But that follows because he thinks that what people most want involves the well-being of other people. And that, partly the whole question depends on how you think of the self. So if you're already starting from a relational view of the self, then already I think this distinction between selfishness and altruism is going to fall apart. But I think on this, I'll just say, I think Mengzi is right on this, and it's remarkable to me. I think it should be an embarrassment for any philosopher to draw that contrast between selfishness and altruism, right? It just doesn't make sense. I mean, if we think about almost anything we do that would appear good, it's grounded partly in the fact that we care about that thing, and it's, I mean, I don't know, I can think of lots of examples, right? I mean, I'm thinking, if a student who I've worked with a lot, gets a good job or like writes a great paper, I partly feel like that's me accomplishing what I wanted, you know what I mean? But is that selfish? No, like doesn't make any sense to talk about it as selfish, right? And I think this is how Mengzi wants to frame it, precisely because once you frame it that way, it becomes hard to see why we should be altruistic, right? I mean, if your morality is based on denying what you really want, that's very hard to justify, particularly I think in this kind of Chinese naturalistic context. So that ties into, I think, rejecting, but again, really I'd rather say just not using a distinction between moral and non-moral motivations. People often import that into the Mengzi, and it's often used, I think, in a way that's so loose that it's probably not really meaningful. But I think it generally just confuses what's going on in the Mengzi. I think he really thinks me is Shen, right? Shen Qi de Shen, a body that has various kinds of organs that have various kinds of pleasures and desires and motivations. And when he says, my heart desires rightness and coherence, ili, in the same way that my mouth desires roasted meat, I think he means that literally. Like, really, these are all just natural things that we want. And it's a matter of balancing them and finding the right relationships between them. Right? The last thing that it does then is I think, shift orientation on the question of why I should be good. So for Mengzi, the question why I should be good, we should think of that in the same way that we would think, like, why should I eat food that I like? I don't need an argument for why I should eat the food that I like. The fact that I like them is already a reason to eat them. There, of course, might be reasons not to, based on other things that I care about, right? So, I mean, we can still compare reasons, but there's the assumption is in favor of the thing that I want to do. Right. And so if what I want is tied in with the well-being of other people, to say, well, why should I do that is weird then, right? For Mengzi, I think that's the way he's trying to frame this question, or the way he's trying to look at this question. Okay. The last thing that I want to say before moving into possible objections or problems is how I think Mengzi's claims are supposed to function. So because we're coming as academics and as academic philosophers, for most of us, maybe insofar as we're reading Mengzi for all of us, we tend to read him as like his purpose is, he has a philosophy and his purpose is to justify it. And I think that's, of course, that's going on, but I don't think that's really the right way to read the text. And I doubt that it's the right way to read any classical Chinese philosophy texts. It's maybe a little strong, but I don't think it's the right way to read most of them, at least. So think about what's he really trying to do with this text. And I realize I'm speaking very carelessly. He didn't write a text, right? So what's he trying to do is, we might say, what's he trying to do in saying the things he says? What's somebody trying to do in putting them together into a book, right? So I'm just bracketing that for simplicity. I think there's two functions. So one is political. So he wants to argue that social order can and does largely rely on these pro-social emotions. And the corollary of that is to minimize the role of punishments and rewards. And I think his claim here, as with all of his claims about ethics, is both descriptive and prescriptive, right? So I think he's trying to say, look, if you really look at it, it's obvious that this is true, that social order relies largely on these kind of pro-social emotions and not on punishments and rewards, right? And that seems, again, to me, just be obviously true, right? And you could just think for yourself about the things you do. I mean, it partly depends, I think, on one's circumstances, where one lives, all these kinds of things, how invested you are in the stuff that you do, but, for any of us who have jobs as professors that are stable, we could teach like crap, right? And nothing's going to happen to us. For me, I mean, I'm tenured in a job that's probably my ideal job, and we don't even have like merit raises. I mean, I could do a terrible job teaching for the rest of my life and nothing would happen to me. So why would I not just do a terrible job? Probably I'd be embarrassed, I'd be ashamed, you know what I mean? Like maybe I want the students to like me, I don't know. We could go through and think, I do actually think I care about the students. I don't want to waste their time. I care about at least the philosophy that I do, right? I want to promote that. And I think the vast majority of stuff we do in our lives is like that, right? And it's amongst us partly saying like, look, this is the way things actually work. And then he's making a prescriptive view, like, and let's focus and emphasize and develop the part that's relying on these pro-social emotions. And I think he partly does think the more you do try to rely on punishments and rewards, that actually can tend to undermine these other kind of pro-social emotions. And I think that's really the heart of his critique of one of his critiques of the Moas, is by always emphasizing benefit, li, and rewards and punishments, they're undermining this actual kind of fabric that keeps a kind of social order. Anyway, that's more the kind of side topic from what I'm talking about today. With I'm trying to check my time. All right. With personal cultivation, I'm not quite sure how to put it. But what I think he's trying to do, and again, he, maybe being whoever put the text together, is speak to each person who's encountering the text, whatever, hearing Mengzi talk, hearing someone repeat what Mengzi said. And I think what it's trying to do is say, pay attention to what you really care about. Like, think about what you really care about and look for those things that are positive, right? Things that are, let's say, maybe pro-social motivations, and then try to act on those, and then try to structure your life so that you're able to act on those. And I think there's a flip side to it, which is to say, I mean, Mengzi doesn't think you could have a good life without sensory pleasures. So think about how you can train those so that they're compatible with the good motivation. So I'm not a vegetarian, but an obvious one would be to like cultivate a taste for non-meat things because it does much less damage to the environment and to animals and all these kinds of things, right? He's also not a vegetarian, of course, but this would seem to follow, right? But things like that. Cultivate so you can enjoy things that don't do much harm, that don't cost a lot. And I think when I say socially constructive activities, things that are, that are pleasurable and build community. So I'm thinking of like, having potluck dinners or something like that. For Mengzi, it would be doing some kind of weird dances probably, right? Or playing music together, these kinds of things. Oh. Okay, so this is, I think, how we should look at the functions. Let me now move to potential objections. So one that I commonly get from students is the claim that some people lack these feelings entirely. We maybe would call those people psychopaths. I think that's probably true, but if we think about the functions of Mengzi's account, I don't think they're relevant, right? So he doesn't think that you will ever have a social order that doesn't use any punishments. And he doesn't think that everybody's going to be motivated by these pro-social emotions. So his claim, the political claim, depends on a substantial majority of people being motivated by those emotions, not on everybody being motivated by them. The personal cultivation point is interesting because that objection only works on that level if you yourself are a psychopath, right? So, I mean, it is certainly the case that if you think, no, like, I just don't care about anyone. And you think, I can imagine a child in danger, but like, it'd probably be amusing to watch them fall, right? Then it is the case that Mengzi's philosophy is not going to appeal to you, right? Like, that is certainly the case. But again, I don't know that that's a serious objection to Mengzi's philosophy, because obviously his philosophy is not going to convince a lot of people, right? And every philosophy fails to convince lots of people. So I don't think it's a serious objection, right? But it does, and this maybe goes to Paul's idea of like, what are we doing with philosophy? It does conflict with some things that Mengzi says, probably, right? So if you're just looking for like, he's wrong in saying this, then this might be a fair objection. But I think if you're trying to look at like, what is he trying to do? What's the point here? I don't think it's a good objection. The second objection would be to say, well, maybe the heart itself has bad motivations. And so, I put some possible examples here: envy, Schadenfreude. You maybe could say that we find some actual just pleasure in dominating other people, maybe humiliating other people, some version of will to power. This would seriously complicate Mengzi's account, because he gives an optimistic view where we have these good motivations based in the heart, and we have these desires for sensory pleasure and a long life that really can be reconciled with them with the right training, right? And so you can have the long life, do the right thing, eat your bear paw, right? And this can all fit together. And if it were true that the heart has inherently bad motivations, that would not be possible, right? We'd be inherently conflicted. But I think it's not that forceful of objection against Mengzi, because again, in 682, he recognizes that it doesn't actually all fit together all the time. Like, sometimes we do actually just have to sacrifice one part of our motivations for another part of our motivations. It would mean that we have to do that a lot. Mengzi seems to think we only have to do that in exceptional circumstances. It would mean we have to do it in a lot of circumstances, and that might make his philosophy less appealing, right? But I don't think it's like I think he can adjust to accommodate that, except that maybe it would impact the third point, right? Which would be to say that, okay, we do have these pro-social motivations, but they don't actually naturally dominate. And it's clear that in practice, they sometimes do and they sometimes don't. And Mengzi himself says that, right? In fact, they often don't for regular people. Mengzi's argument is that facing death, they do. But he might be wrong about that, right? I said, like, sure, for some people they do, but for most people, it's hard to say for sure. Or we might just say that's not the most revealing context. So yeah, like in an extreme, these will dominate, but day to day they don't. And maybe day to day is the more relevant thing, right? So this is a problem for him, I think, that I'm not sure he can address. But I think the really big problem is the fourth one, right? Which is, you could say he can't move from a descriptive to a prescriptive position. And what I mean by that is that he says that these motivations are natural, but he recognizes that they are not necessary, right? They can be strengthened or they can be weakened. And he seems to suggest that they could even be eliminated. So if these were things we necessarily had, then he'd have a fairly simple position to say, like, yeah, just if you really reflect on what you want, you'll see that this is how you should live, and then live that way. But it's more complicated than that, because for sure, he's not just saying, do what you want, but he's also saying what we should want, right? Which is to care more, let's say, right? And that, I think, is the difficult thing for his position. So I think you could look at it actually as two levels. So one would be his argument that we should care more, right? Want more, let's say, or his argument that we should just avoid trying to want less, right? I formulated it in that second way. So this is how I put it. The key question, and this is, to me, and again, I'm being very frank here, like, to me, really the key question in my life. And I put this up here. I don't want to get too personal, but my father's in hospice care. I was just down in Florida taking care of him, and I need to go back, and I'm worried about it. But I just started a new semester. It's the first week of classes. I feel like I've got a responsibility to my students. And then I agreed to give this talk way back when it seemed like it would be a fine time to give a talk. And it turned out to not be a very convenient time to give a talk. So the question is, like, should I train myself to care less about my father or my students or this talk? I want to talk about all of them together, because I genuinely think that I probably could. Like, I couldn't just stop caring right now, but I think if I set that as my goal, I probably could care less and less, and maybe I could stop caring entirely. So what would be the advantages of that? They're obvious, right? I mean, and I put it in Zhuangzi's terms. The advantage is xiao yao you, right? I mean, if I cared less about these things, my life would be a lot less stressful, be less frustrating. I'd have less occasions of sadness. I would definitely have more freedom, right? And I think this, I won't try to argue for this, but I do think that it kind of fits reality. Like, I do think none of these things actually matter. In, say 100 years, my students will still be around in 100 years probably, right? But in 200 years, there's probably be no trace of any of these things left, right? In 1,000 years, there's a good chance there will be no trace of humankind left, right? So I don't think that these really matter in some objective way, right? They just matter to me. And I think that Zhuangzi would agree with that. And my reading of him there is, I think, somewhat controversial, but I think that's why he wants to say my caring about them is really like my liking Sichuan food. My liking Sichuan food doesn't commit me to some claim that, like, from the point of view of the universe, it's the best food possible. Like, I recognize that makes no sense at all. And in exactly the same way, my caring about my father doesn't commit me to a view that in the view of the universe, he matters somehow, right? So what is Zhuangzi's argument here? I think his main argument is a claim that strengthening the motivations of the heart is the only way to end up with a stable purpose in life, because that allows a kind of coherence between these pro-social motivations, sensory pleasures that can be reconciled with them, and then like how we actually act in the world and try to change the world. I'm not convinced by that argument, but I do think, if I decided I don't want to care about these, right, it would make my life very contradictory for a while, right? Because I would still be caring about them. I'd still be feeling about them, and I'd be trying to resist that and trying to do different things, right? And it would make my life, I think, disunified in a certain way. Although ultimately, maybe I could bring about a kind of unification that was based purely on, sensory pleasures and me living a long, peaceful life. A second argument that I think is in the background for him is a belief that the world will be better if we convince people to care about their parents and to care about their students and to care about, well, not to care about their presentations, really. It's not really going to make the world better, but you see my points. That I feel like is a pretty convincing argument to me, which is not, of course, to say the world will be better if everybody becomes Confucian, which involves a lot more, right? But if we just focus on this more minimal point from the Zhuangzi, there's something weird about that view, because really what I'd be saying there is that I think there's good justification for my writing this book to convince people to be Menxian, even if maybe there's not enough justification for me to become Menxian. And that's something seems weird about that, but I think that split is something that they're very aware of in Chinese philosophy. I think that it's very present in the Mozi, where there's a sense of what's going to convince you, but also like what should you promote, right? And that what you should promote is a valid question. And I think that's partly what Zhuangzi is doing. The last thing I'll mention is that Zhuangzi does make an argument that, keeping these feelings preserves what's distinctively human in us. I think that's a totally bad argument, right? I think Zhuangzi shows why that's a bad argument. So I just set that aside. All right, I'm heading toward a conclusion. So I just say, if I really just look at this philosophically, argument-wise, I think the Zhuangzi position wins here, right? I think that I should care less than I do position wins. I'm not sure of that, but I think that that's the case. But this is then where there's something weird happening, right? Because the reality is, I don't want to care less about these things. And I think that supports Zhuangzi's point that, at least for me, the motivations of the heart have some priority over the other concerns, and that I'm doing what I really want, even if at the same time it makes me unhappy in various kinds of ways. And I think the way Zhuangzi's argument works is to rely on enough people feeling the same way, right? Maybe I could justify my not wanting to care less about these things, but I really think any justification I gave would be circular, right? And I think a Buddhist or a Zhuangist could argue that I'm really just trapped by my own values. Like, I've committed to certain values and I don't want to change them, right? And I think that's probably true. And Zhuangzi might also even agree with that. right? I mean, that's the only justification for these things is the fact that we do care about them, right? And that is going to be kind of inherently circular, I think. I'm not sure. I mean, you can see from my talk, this is the part where I'm really not sure what I'm talking about. And this is the kind of the last step, right? So what does this mean to think about, to defend Meng's system, or even think of what he's trying to do? Well, it's going to depend on the person, right? Because if someone doesn't care or prefers to care less, I'm not sure Meng has any response to that, right? And I think he might just say, yeah, okay. You know what he would say? He would say, hey, you're wrong. You actually do care, and think about it. And, you know, I heard this story about you seeing this ox going to slaughter and you let him go. Like, that's what he would say. He wouldn't believe you, right? But if it were sincere, I think he would just say, okay, like, you can't convince that person in the same way that someone who doesn't like a certain taste, you're not going to convince them to like it. It also would mean the persuasiveness of it would depend on the circumstances. So I did think, you know, if I'm consistently unable to act on the things I care about, then I really would think I might prefer to care less, right? And I put a reference in pretending here because I was revising this book while I was reading you and Jurg's book and thinking, what you're arguing makes sense if you're stuck doing things that you don't really want to do. But that I still think if you can make it so that you're doing things you actually care about, like actually caring about them, seems preferable to me. But I have no argument for that, right? This just seems like preferable. It would mean that Meng's philosophy might apply best to those with some level of privilege, right? So, I mean, again, like if you were stuck in some job where you're doing things that you actually don't care about, or you don't have the means to help the people you care about, then Meng's philosophy is probably not the best philosophy, maybe. I don't know. But even there, I do think Meng's allows for some point of not caring, right? There's some point where like you just can't do it anymore and you got to let it go. And this is where Meng's himself would appeal to Ming, right? So I think there is even in Meng's some level of that. Overall, I think what I'm getting at is that Meng's philosophy is not just like meant to persuade us logically, but as aspirational, maybe inspirational. That sounds really cheesy to say inspirational, but maybe that's the way to put it. Because most of us could go either way, I think. Like we could be convinced to care more, or we could be convinced to care less, because there's good reasons in both directions. And it's going to depend on what we attend to, maybe what stimulates us, right? How we attend to it. And so the last passage I put here, which is another one that I would think of as maybe one of the most important passages in the whole Mengzi, is 7b24. So Mengzi said, the mouth toward flavors, the eye toward colors, the ears toward sounds, the nose toward sense, the forelimbs toward peaceful ease. These are natural dispositions, right? Sheng, but they also involve Ming, fate. The noble do not speak of them as natural dispositions. Benevolence between father and son, rightness between sovereign and minister, propriety between guest and host, knowledge for the worthy, sagacity in the way of heaven. These are fated, right? They're Ming, but they also involve Sheng dispositions. The noble do not speak of them as subject to fate. So it's a weird claim, right? And what he's saying here is that in what the nobles say, they're not just considering the objective truth, right? I think it is a factor. You can't just make stuff up completely, but it's not the only factor, right? And so they describe things in, maybe the positive way to put it would be in selective ways, but you could also just say misleading ways, right? And what's most interesting about this passage is not that Junzi do this, but that someone decided to put it in Mengzi's book, because it seems like it says like, yeah, I said all that stuff about Xing Shan, but yeah, maybe that's not exactly true, right? That's just the way I like to describe it. It's weird to put that in the book, right? And I think why, we could speculate on why, and I think I'd probably give a whole paper on just this passage, but I think it's partly Mengzi himself saying, this isn't just about like what's true here, right? This is about like what's going to motivate you in certain ways, right? And how to describe things in certain ways. And he's going to convince you by describing things in certain ways. And if you're going to convince yourself, you're going to want to focus on describing things in certain ways. So I guess the concluding thing I would say is that maybe all philosophy works that way, right? It's not the way that philosophers think of philosophy working, but maybe it is in fact the way that all philosophy works. I'm not sure, but I think there's something interesting and strange in Mengzi's methodology in this way, right? Okay, so I will stop there then. I hope I didn't talk too fast. I got a little overexcited at points. I'll stop sharing the screen also so people can see other people's faces better.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Our first commentator is Professor Zhu Ping from the Department of Modern Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at University of Oklahoma. Professor Zhu, we would like to invite you to share your thoughts or comments or your questions for our speaker, please.
Thank you, Ting-Ting. And I would also like to thank Paul for organizing this 四海为学 lecture series and inviting me to be one of the commentators for Professor Perkins' lecture today. It is a great honor of mine to join all today. I have to admit that I'm not a philosopher scholar. My background is gender studies and literary studies. So I'm just going to provide some of my thoughts as one general reader. And I'm sure Professor Jiang will comment more expertly a few minutes later. So doing what you really want is the title of Professor Perkins' new book. And I think it's a very catchy phrase because I want it has been an extremely popular phrase in our daily life and in our contemporary feel-good culture, right? People hardly pause to ask themselves what they really want. They just say, I want it all the time. And Professor Perkins' book actually uses Mengzi's philosophy to tell us that in order to know what you really want, one must first understand the notion of the self. The self is the agency that produces the desires and the motivations. And the self is always a being in the world. As Mengzi tells us, the self is connected with and lives in the world like a plant. I read this in the book. Like a plant, right? Human beings are born with a need for connection with the others. And we inherently have this intersubjective and empathetic engagement with the others, which is our primordial form of relating to the world. So the self is the open and organic structure. We often forget this, but the self is actually an open structure, not an enclosed entity with fixed boundaries. Therefore, in Mengzi's analogy, which we just heard about in the lecture, choosing rightness over life is just like choosing bear paw over fish. It is not viewed as a sacrifice, but rather as a more sensible and a better choice, right? A bear paw actually is better than fish in Mengzi's eyes. So choosing rightness over life is not something that would cause displeasure or pain, but rather it is the open and the connected self rather gains more through making such a choice. And the modern man can hardly understand this kind of gain in choosing rightness over life today, because in the modern times, the self is dissociated from the world and becomes the closed, private self. Today, the motivations for being good, doing collective work, and caring for the others are viewed as external social imperatives that we have to comply with, not something that is heartfelt or inherent. And the culture we live in today is a culture of commodity. It relentlessly teaches us to take care of our private needs and our own body. And it often instills in us the idea that only the perverted, alienated, asocial, or antisocial desires are our true desires and motivations. This has literally reduced us from human beings to animals. And at the same time, we must remember that Mengzi lived in the time of smallholder economy during the Warring States period in China. Smallholder farmers lived in a self-sufficient life, and they relied on kinship and local communities to minimize the risks of natural and man-made disasters, not only for oneself, but also for the extended family. The typical household I read from the internet of Mengzi's time had 5 to 8 members in one household. So in such kind of a economy, we can call it moral economy. It is very important for people to rely on the reciprocal moral guidelines. And Professor Perkins just told us that Mengzi proposed the four hearts, right? The heart of compassion and pain, the heart of shame and aversion, the heart of declining and yielding, the heart of affirming and denying. These are reciprocal moral principles that people during Mengzi's time relied in order to, guard off the natural human-made disasters. But the question we are facing today is, how is Mengzi's teaching relevant to today, right? To the contemporary world. And because we live in a very different capitalist globe, and our desires and motivations should have changed with the changing economic relations and productive forces. So I'm also curious to find out, if Mengzi is alive today, what he would really want, right? Okay, so reading this book, Doing What You Really Want, I found that Mengzi, even during his time, was already aware of the danger of thinking abstractly, of replacing quality with quantity. And this is something presented in the two major examples in Professor Perkins' lecture. One example is the example of the beggar. The other example is the example of food and a wife, right? In the example of the beggar would deny one basket of food or one cup of stew in face of sneer or insult. However, Mengzi also mentioned that no one would deny 10,000 bushels of grain as salary, right? So people would most likely lose their rooted heart, their 本心, in face of such great amount of reward or salary. And in the other story, food and the wife, Wu Luzi was asking about the importance of propriety, and Mengzi particularly reminded him that you have to put the two things in comparison on the same equal footing, right? Like gold is heavier, but you cannot compare a gold clasp with a cartload of feathers, for example, right? Because the quantities of those two things are different. So such kind of comparison is not legal in the first place. And I find these examples interesting because the mathematical mind, the calculative mind, or thinking abstractly is actually one of the most prominent feature of the capitalist culture, right? In the capitalist society, we were trained to look at things at their exchange value instead of their use value. And exchange values are numbers. They're abstract. They have nothing to do with the intrinsic qualities of the things. And Mengzi was already aware of the danger of losing the quantities of things if people think in abstract ways. So I find in these two examples, this particular relevance of Mengzi in repudiating today's culture or in reflecting today's technological thinking, the trend of technological thinking. So I think if you ask today's people to choose between a bear paw or fish, they would choose the bear paw only because the bear paw is more expensive. However, that was not Mengzi's reason, right? He was not comparing the prices. And it is important to realize that he was not comparing the prices. He was comparing two things. He was comparing two different qualities. So I think that is why I'm really grateful for this book, because it basically discovered Mengzi for me. Mengzi was not my favorite, I have to admit, before reading this book, Doing What You Really Want. I think Mengzi now offers a great resource for me to think about the capitalist society, to repudiate, the contemporary culture. So for that, I want to thank Professor Perkins. And of course, if possible, I would like to know if Professor Perkins can tell us more about how Mengzi was dealing with abstract numbers or exchange values in other passages of writings. Maybe I was not aware. So thank you very much.
Okay, according to the guideline, I'm going to allow Professor Perkins to take Zhuping's comments and questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Zhuping, thank you so much for those comments. And I I have to admit, I hadn't really thought about that issue, both of the abstractness and of the difference involved in the kind of dislocation from community that we have as well in modern times, right? I recognize Mengzi is a harsh critic of, would be a harsh critic of advertising, right, and marketing, and that sense that, like, of always trying to get something more, because that's based out in this punishment reward kind of model that he thinks undermines these feelings of caring. But I hadn't really thought about it so much. I mean, on the one hand, that I mean, we're constantly drawn away from particularistic connections, right? Not just with sort of how commodities are viewed in abstract terms and quantifiable terms, but also really in our mobility, right? And this is maybe part of the problem of certain groups of people, including a certain elite that many of us are part of, right? Where we move from place to place and we're not sort of located in one place. And that is going to tend to actually, the order that comes from these kind of pro-social feelings is going to be minimized more, right? When you don't know anybody, when you're constantly moving through new places. I do wonder if maybe Mengzi, like, that is actually partly in the background for Mengzi, some contrast between, this maybe makes them sound too Taoist, but the kind of order that you would find in kind of smaller communities, and the fact that, I mean, even in his time, there's a lot of social mobility, right? And people are moving around and dealing with things in these kind of more less personally connected, but I think also more abstract terms. I think your emphasis on the 10,000 bushels is really cool, and I wish I'd seen that. I wish that, I mean, I like reading Mengzi as a critique of capitalism, and I wish that I had seen those things more clearly earlier, that you brought up. So I really appreciate your adding that to it.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out them to me, because I didn't notice that before reading your book. Thank you.
Okay, if Professor Zhu doesn't have any further questions, then we are going to invite our second commentator, Jiang Tao, Professor of Chinese and Buddhist Philosophies at Rutgers University. Professor Jiang, we would like to hear your opinions about the presentation, or if you have any questions for Professor Perkins, please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this really interesting panel. And I also appreciate Frank's really marvelous new book, Do What You Really Want. And of course, the presentation is a great illustration of that. And I think it's, you persuaded me a lot in the mentioned direction, right? Even though I'm probably not quite bought into the package yet. So it's going to be a bit of a tug of war in terms of whether it's a matter of persuading or dissuading when it comes to Mencius. I think it's Mencius, for me, sometimes, that it's almost too optimistic, sort of in terms of his understanding of humans, and his model of humans is sometimes just not weird enough. It's almost too normal, and it's so relatable, and that it's not. So that might have been his attraction, which I think it's what's underlying a lot of your presentation, that it's that it sees this as a viable sort of alternative, right, to the kind of the kind of relationship-based sort of morality and naturalist kind of morality. I think I do see that point, but I also another thing is that I also tend to see more tension and conflict in Mencius' view. So here I'm gonna despite my admiration for the work, and you know how much I love all of your work. So I'm gonna push a bit on the really part, right? So that part seems to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in your deliberation on Mencius, because it's we know Mencius was very good at telling stories, and he contains a lot of powerful just imaginaries or just stories or made up or something like that, and that those stories are very helpful in making his case, and so that tends to be very, very compelling. But but sometimes it depends on what story we latched onto in the text, then and also how the story is framed. And we know he's a master in framing how a story should be interpreted. And in order to get to where he really wants you to get to, right? So again, it's the really part that I find to be interesting. I like the Shun story, you know, and you know the, you know, from my book on, you know, from my chapter on mentions that, you know, the Shun story is a really important episode in the Men's corpus. So because a lot of the imaginaries that that you cite in the text, it's about, oh, I'm going to deal with this about my father, about you know, somebody who's a beggar, you know, you drag a virgin, you know, daughter from your neighbor and stuff like that. But what if the story is told in a different way, right? You know, and he was clearly aware of the way the story is told and how it's framed, and makes a huge difference. So what about a parent, right, who's abusive in your entire life, and then commits a murder, and then what do you do about that parent, right? So it's not just you know, some, you know, sort of generic sort of father, you know, or generic parent who, you know, in its, you know, in a regular sense, but somebody who is actually very who's very bad and traumatic. And so, and that this of course was the hypothetical Shun story. And I, you know, I don't know about Meng's solution, or his supposed solution to that problem. So I want to hear what you think about that. So it's, you know, so, and we know that a parent can do a lot of damage, right? And that, and for any confusion, that they should be more aware of this, of the kind of damage that they might have to their children. So if a damaged person at the hands of abusive parents still put parents' need above themselves, I'm not sure that's actually a reflection of what such a self really wants, right? So then it's rather, it could be rather a reflection of a rather warped sense of self, however the conception of self is, and also it's a kind of a messed up need, right? And how do I deal with situations like that, right? Again, getting to the doing what I really want, because what I want can be, you know, lots of things in conflict. But, you know, one of the compelling case that you're making in interpreting Mencius is that if you actually, you know, you sort of analyze your situation, you know, all you want, and then you actually find something that's more powerful, that's deeper, and that is what you actually want, what you really want, and what you should want. So though when it comes to, you know, a self that that is in some ways damaged, how, you know, that I'm not sure how to get to that particular point, and this is reflected in the Shun story, and I wonder whether the sort of the choice that Shun made was actually reflective of that damaged self, despite his, you know, sage-kin status. So that's one question. The other question is, it's similar to the sort of the objection that you raised at the very end about the how do you go from descriptive to prescriptive. So if doing what you really want is also what you should want, where does the should come from? Right? Where, you know, sort of what's the source of the should? Because what you really want could be, you know, if there's no guideline, if there's no guidance in terms of which way is the deeper, is the real want part, then there seems to be that there needs to be some sort of guidance towards the want that assume the status of the normative, right? That it should want. But where does the should come from? And so that, you know, that's another question that I have. But anyway, you know, hopefully it makes sense. Thank you for the great work.
Yeah, those are both really great questions and really hard questions also to figure out. So you're right that a lot of the work is on the really part, right? And the book would be a lot different if it just said doing what you want, right? That a lot of work is on what the really part. And I'm trying to think of, so on the Shun story, right, Mengzi's answer seems to be emphasizing actually that helping his father flee would be what he really wanted. Like it emphasizes that he wouldn't have regrets about it. He would forget the kingdom and he would do it, right? So in that case, Mengzi seems to think it's not such a problematic case, I think. But it's a strong case of having to sacrifice other things that you want for what you really want. So in that way, it's kind of probably like a kind of 6A10 kind of illustration where, I mean, of course, he wants to be emperor and do all these things too, and he has to make that sacrifice.
But then it's wouldn't. What I'm trying to contest is that yes, that's Mencius sort of, so that's his view, but is that really the sort of, should that be the view, let's say, in a contemporary world, right?
Right. Well, I think, I mean, the core of your question I took to be, how do we know what we really want? You know, and how do we get a kind of normativity into that? Because, yeah, I mean, Mengzi does think that we're not always right about what we want, right? That's why it's what you really want, not just what you happen to want. But he always seems to have this optimistic sense that, like, I don't know. So I really don't know how to answer the question, right? So I think from Mengzi's perspective, on the one hand, he maybe thinks that if we really examine ourselves, we will be able to tell what we really want. You know, so some sense of like a sincerity of examining, we will see it. But I think he also kind of there's kind of two external guidances to it. So one is his general claim about human nature. I mean, in a sense that he does think we all share the same nature. So what I really want should correspond to what other people really want. You know, so I think that's one way that he would try to approach it, trying to say like, well, you know, if you say, well, I don't know what I really want, or I think this is what I want, but I think he would probably want to appeal to other examples and other people. I'm not sure that works, you know, but I think that would be one direction. But I do think there's a weird rhetorical thing going on, that he's not just trying to get you to find what you really want, but trying to get you to become a person who's better for the society, right? So I think he's going to be biased towards saying the thing you really want is the thing that's going to make society better. So for him, that's going to be the loyalty to your father. I don't think that would be for us. You know, I don't think we would make the same decision as that on him. But I think this is where there's a kind of misleading rhetoric to the entire book, you know, and I'll say, like, I'm not convinced necessarily that when I want sort of conflicting things, the good thing is the thing that I really want. I'm not sure. I think that if Mengzi says, like, that's the thing you really want, and I think about it, I might say, like, yeah, okay, that is the thing I really want. And maybe that would be better for me in the long run and better for the world in the long run, you know. I think that's kind of the way that the text is working, you know, and I suppose that's kind of the way my own book is working as well, you know, is I'm not totally sure this stuff is right, you know, but it's trying to encourage a certain way of looking at things. But this idea of like, what if your self is damaged is a really hard question, you know, and it's a way in which maybe, again, Mengzi is maybe assuming a level of privilege, maybe, you know, and he is, I mean, there's a weird tension in Mengzi between trusting your feelings and not, because he is part of the argument, like, you need to trust your feelings. So what if you feel like because of your situation you can't trust your feelings? Mengzi would criticize that and would say, no, like, trust your feelings. But on the other hand, he is saying, like, you should feel certain ways, you know, and so he can say you should trust your feelings, but also say, well, and think about what it is you really want. Like, that's not what you really want, is it? You know. So I don't know. I think those are all really hard questions. The second thing on the prescriptive side, I think connects to that. So part of the prescriptive side would be, his idea of how you go about realizing those values, right? So he's going to say like, yeah, okay, we, normal people don't want needless suffering in the world. It makes us feel bad. And okay, but so what should we do about that? Well, it's really hard to say what we should do about that, because what we should do isn't necessarily the obvious thing to do, right? So, it's not necessarily to give money to the homeless guy. It could be donating to a homeless shelter or whatever. It's not easy to see what's the right thing to do. Now, he believes that, the sages and Confucius have figured out the best things to do. So if you have these kind of concerns, you should follow what they said to do because they've worked it out. That I think is not plausible now. That's an aspect that I think isn't plausible. But I think that's partly where the prescriptive side would be to say, yeah, okay, we do all we care about these things, but how do we enact that, right? We could say, well, okay, if this is what you care, I guess these are hypothetical imperatives essentially, right? If this is what you care about, then this is what you ought to do. The ought applied to what we should care about is harder. And it is one thing that I'm not sure Mengzi can really justify, so why should I try to care more? I think, again, I think his motivation partly is to think, well, we'll all be better off if you do. And that's reason enough to try to convince you. But if I'm really thinking for the individual, why try to care more than I actually do? Yeah, I'm not sure that he has a good argument for that. I guess it would be some sense of, again, kind of having a sense of purpose and a sense of coherence to one's life that maybe you could argue you get more by developing these. Maybe more consistently building your life around them, you get a sense of kind of coherence and less kind of internal conflict and things like that. But I do think that's another weakness in his system, so I do think if I really step back and evaluate, even say how it appeals to me, I do think it makes me a better person, but it doesn't appeal to me to want to be a sage. It doesn't convince me that I should try to be a really great person. It just doesn't do that for me. So I think it makes me feel a little better than I am probably if I think about Mengzi, but it doesn't convince me that yeah, I should just dedicate my life to these things. And I don't know what Mengzi would say about that, other than that I'm a Xiaoren. Yeah, anyway, thanks for those comments. They're really helpful.
Okay. Now we are moving to the Q&A session, and it seems that we have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to open the floor for questions from our audience. So if any of the participants want to ask any questions, you can either wave your hands or drop a message in the chat box, and Paul will help us to unmute you or something, right?
Yeah, I think everyone should be able to unmute themselves. So
Great. Is there anyone who wants to ask questions?
I can make a really brief comment, maybe. I know, Frank, you asked me to say something about the Zhuangzi. I would hold off though, because I think that's kind of a big topic, but I think connecting Ping Ju's point with Hao Jiang's, I wonder if we might think about the response that you just gave, right, Frank? These things, when I think about whether or not they really make me want to be a good person or something like that, maybe they're not super convincing. But I wonder if also the way we think about this today in a as more individuals who don't live in these communities all the time, I wonder if that really changes the argument, right? Because if I'm with other people all the time, then my motivation to be kind of a better person, right, is sort of higher because I'm always thinking about how other people see me, right? It's kind of if you're in front of your my nephew, right? When I'm around my nephew, I'm just, or around my parents or around my students or something, right? My motivation or whatever, right, to be a good person is so much higher than when I'm just by myself. And I think a lot of times when we think about this, right, because your question, doing what you really want, you could ask that from a very abstract individual perspective, or you could ask it from one where you're constantly with other people. And I think you would get totally different experiences of the question.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've tried to think about it in concrete terms. I think that's right, that our situation is just very different, right? But I try to think really like, why shouldn't I just blow off my class? That I'm teaching. Like that's the kind of question. Well, because they're students, and even before I knew them this week, like I feel a certain responsibility toward them, and it's very concrete. And it's very different from asking like, why should I be good? That's a very different kind of question to think. Why should I don't know. I don't want to go down to Florida and stay with my father. Or I mean, I guess maybe that's what I really want to do. That's what I'm probably going to do, right? But like, that's the question, like, why should I do that? Why should I want to do that? And that's, again, they're very different from thinking like, why should I be a good person? What I mean? Because it is very concrete. And I feel like thinking about it in abstract terms is really missing like the actual essence of ethics, and that's a kind of an existentialist point of view, I guess, also,
Okay, Tim Connolly, he wants to ask a question, please.
Hey, great to see you, Frank, and I
Yeah,
really
great to see you, Tim.
your talk, and learned a lot from it. I just had a question about future preferences and how they might factor in to this account. There are things we don't want now, but maybe in the future we might be glad that we did them, and things that we want now for our future, but in the meantime, if we want to get those things in the future, we have to do a lot of things that we don't want. So I was thinking one gloss on the really might be something like in the long term, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we would want. And I think your notion of coherence, living a life of coherence, right? That you would look back on, and you would see it's filled with things that you may not have fully embraced at the time, but you are just happy that you did them when you look back on them, right? So I'm just curious about your I don't know that future preferences played that much of a role in the Mengzi, but I'm just trying to think about it a little bit. So I'm curious to hear your ideas about this.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And that I think that you're right, that's part of what the really is getting at, right? Is thinking about the long-term consequences, but maybe, yeah, the broader, like how it's gonna fit in with everything else also, right? That's, I guess, more the coherence view. But I think thinking about the long-term consequences, and I mean, certainly I'm trying to think if Mengzi signals that anywhere. I don't know that he does, but it seems like realistically that is a big part of it, right? I mean, so part of like this, thinking about what we really care about is thinking like, well, will I really regret or not? And that's part of thinking, well, what do I really want? But it might be that right now I'd rather do something else, but I know that given what I do really want, this will really bother me in the long term, right? Or something like that. So yeah, I think that's a helpful way to kind of cash out the one aspect of the really that's in there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Andrew Lambert, you are the next. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
So yes, still getting a hang of this Zoom thing. Thank you for the talk, Frank. I'm sorry, I haven't read your book, but I do have a question based on the talk. I really like the way you have this kind of three-pronged analysis, right, of pro-social emotion, desire, and action. And it seems like you sort of want to triangulate between them to arrive at a notion of the good life, right? That desire should be curbed around these underlying pro-social emotions in order to, or again, in some sense of how they coordinate with action. And I just wanted to ask you two things. First of all, could you say a bit more about how you see that kind of process actually working, that you have pro-social emotions that can set a baseline of what's acceptable. You have like embodied desire, maybe also imaginative desire, if it's not just based on bodily sensory perception and so on. And then you have this notion of action, some sort of worthwhile life ends that we should aim for. I haven't read the book, but do you have a sort of description of how that plays out, just a little bit more detail in that regard? And the second question, which maybe we don't have time for, which is fine. It seems like you have this kind of existential dimension to the talk there about, why should I care? Why should I kind of go through with this? And I wasn't quite sure how that related to Mencius, right? Because as Tao said, Mencius is a very positive, optimistic thinker. And I wasn't quite sure, are you getting that from the Mencius, or is that just implicit in the text but isn't brought out? Why was there this need to sort of bring in the Zhuangzian sort of skepticism? And again, maybe that's in the book and that's dealt with. If you have time to say something about that would be great.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for both those. And it's good to see you again. It's been a long time since we've met in person. The bringing in the Zhuangzi part really is not, I don't know that it comes up much in the book, and it's not that directly relevant. It's just personally to me, right? So personally to me, that's the key question. And I feel like Zhuangzi is arguing on that you should care less, be less invested in things and less upset about things side. And then Mengzi, I think, is on the opposite side of that, right? But I think, I'm not sure that Mengzi would even see himself. I mean, he certainly wouldn't see himself in relationship to Zhuangzi, right? But I think even that kind of threat from the Zhuangzi of kind of going along with everything, not being so invested in things, I'm not sure that's even one of Mengzi's targets, really. Like he's targeting more against the Mengzi and this kind of punishment reward kind of orientation, sensory desires, and I think less on a seeking kind of calm peace of mind, free and easy wandering kind of view. So that's really just my own framing of it as the question from me. On the first question about the relation between the pro-social emotions and then pleasures and then actions, I think that's maybe not, well, I mean, I think what Mengzi wants to argue is that you can satisfy, you can have these kinds of pleasures if you put these pro-social emotions as the foundation, but you can't do the opposite. Like if you put the foundation as getting certain kinds of pleasures, that's always going to actually be conflicting with what your heart's desiring. And so the hierarchy between them then is justified as the only way to get a kind of coherence in your life, right? So that's kind of the function, I think, for Mengzi in particular. I was more thinking about it in terms of like how these things can fall apart, right? So one situation would be that, there's lots of things that you really want and you constantly have to like not get them, or not you really want them. So there's lots of pleasures, lots of desires you have, and you constantly have to deny yourself because you're dedicated to your parents or your students or whatever other kind of thing. And Mengzi thinks you can have that kind of conflict, but that's not ideal, right? Ideally, you don't want to have that. You want to be able to like enjoy your life, have pleasures, and still align up with these motivations. I also, and this was more part of the talk, was thinking, I mean, if you're in a situation where you care about these things, but like really can't do anything about it, that's a particular kind of incoherence that also would be, I think, not a good life. And so Mengzi definitely thinks you should be, I mean, he's not just interested in people having motivations, he's interested in people acting on that motivation. So he definitely thinks you should be trying to align these, the things you care about should be guiding your actions. But there might be times when that's not possible, right? And then I think that's also going to create a kind of unhappiness to that life. And I think Mengzi does recognize that in places, and that's where he will appeal to Ming, and say like, yeah, in this case, you have to kind of let it go. But there are some cases where he won't do that, like the death of a parent, to just say like, yeah, okay, they're dead. It's inevitable. Go on, accept it. He's reluctant to say that, although, he would maybe say that after a certain time that you have to take that kind of stance, but that's what I was really thinking of was more, these are kind of three things that can come apart and conflict in certain kinds of ways.
Great. Okay. I'm going to give the privilege to ask the clan to ask the last question, please.
Thank you, and thank you for that talk, which I really enjoyed. I also think you are very fortunate in your commentators, because I feel like the questions and comments that you've gotten have really kind of been thought-provoking for me. So I initially didn't have a question, but now I kind of have developed one. And so, I kind of wanted to justify a little bit my joking remark about how you shouldn't be a mention, because you've given such a an attractive reading of Mencius, and now I'm kind of worried. I'm just going, But I kind of feel like it's also a little bit like overly generous to Mencius in some ways. Like I sort of have worries and doubts about whether it's really Mencius or whether it's just kind of Frank using Mencius kind of philosophy. But I guess there are a few things. So Mencius is, I feel like if the world is set up, if the descriptive claims are correct, if the world is set up the way Mencius thinks it is, I think his view is kind of convincing. And so I guess many of my worries involve some of the objections you raised about whether the world really is that way, particularly in terms of whether the, what you're calling the pro-social emotions or dominate, or whether they're just some amongst many, and there are many other ones that are kind of equally strong. And I guess my picture of how the world looks a little bit like that. But the other, and so like, but I think you kind of dealt with this objection. You're just like, oh yeah, it might be that way. And then your life will be less pleasant than Mencius thinks or something, or, but I kind of worry that, that really might be the way the world actually is. And in that case, also kind of some of Pingju's thoughts about capitalism and like how the world that we live in, some things that you said about how the world we live in differs from the world that Mencius lives in, makes that even more pointy, right? Because, the kind of appropriate targets of our pro-social emotions are far from us. We're kind of isolated from, the kind of people that we should most care about. And, the people actually around us, it's kind of like, do we, why should we bother? So, I'm actually kind of looking for a reason to care more, but then I'm thinking in terms of capitalism, we have these pro-social emotions that get manipulated by capitalism. And like, I just wonder if you have like a kind of like, the desire to do a good job, in your work, that can, that's a good thing. You want to be excellent, but you also then get manipulated by the unscrupulous kind of boss or whatever to work your heart out for nothing, right? And is the world better because you're doing that? So this is a little bit far from Mencius, but since we're actually, looking at extension of Mencius, I'm just curious if you have a story about things like that.
Yeah, so those are all really hard questions. I realized as I was giving the talk and then hearing people's comments that, I do think what I said about Mengzi is all correct as a reading of Mengzi, but it's leaving out a lot of Mengzi, right? And a lot of the things that might be kind of objectionable about Mengzi. I try to defend some of those in the book, but I also, this is why I would never say I'm a Confucian. Like, I feel like that's committing to way too much, way more than I would want to commit to, right? So it is a kind of selective part that I'm drawing out. Again, I think it genuinely is there in the Mengzi, but I do think there's a lot of other stuff. And I think that this idea about, it's kind of two key questions, I think, to me out of what you said. So one would be like, what if really these kind of pro-social emotions aren't the dominant thing? Then, there's maybe two ways to look at it come to mind. So one would be, if you still argue that like the most satisfying kind of life was going to be one where these pro-social emotions were made the foundation, then maybe most of what Mengzi says would still hold. So you could argue then, well, we can come to any balance. So let's say we have like these bad motivations of the heart. We've got sensory pleasures. We've got these good motivations. And naturally, these are kind of all in competition with each other, right? Contrary to what Mengzi thinks, but we might say that's realistically the case. The question then would be like, okay, so what do you do with that as an individual? Could you make an argument that building your life on Schadenfreude, like that's going to be the most fulfilling life, and denying the fact that you don't really like to see people suffer? I maybe I'm kind of convinced by Mengzi on this, and maybe that's just I'm falling for a certain kind of propaganda that the good things are going to create a better foundation ultimately for a more fulfilling life from a personal point of view. I do think that compared to bad motivations, I do think that. I think maybe not caring about anything would be better than either void. That seems like a a candidate to me, but I don't think building it on hate, is going to create like a fulfilling kind of life. And I
was
actually don't
thinking
think
more
building it on
greed or
like
something.
Yeah.
More like, I don't know, you're loving to travel around and eating at fancy restaurants or something like that.
Yeah, right. That seems like a more likely candidate, although it's hard for me to imagine that being satisfying, but it surely is satisfying for some people, right? So so that would be one point of view. And then the other point of view, again, would be thinking that what Mengzi is doing is again, trying to make people a certain way, right? And that, the world he thinks will be better off if people believe what he's saying and take these good motivations as the foundation. So I think that's another way to look at it. And I think I do agree with him on that point, but the other real threat is the one you're bringing up. So, I mean, this is all, it is, I mean, the very idea of what's going to create a social order is inherently partly problematic, because the social order is always partly unfair, right? It's always partly bad. And so these things are being used by it, and I think I just mentioned the political function, and I have really confused feelings about that, because I partly feel like, yeah, it is better to have a system that everybody willingly follows rather than one that constantly uses violence to make people do it. But on the other hand, a system that relies on violence at least isn't trying to control how we think about things. You know what I mean? If you get me to do the right thing by making me feel ashamed, I feel like that's better than threatening to beat me, but I'm not completely sure. I don't know. I have slightly mixed feelings about that. And that's maybe a slightly different Zhuangzian perspective, almost like the kind of primitivist perspective on power structures, But ultimately, I probably come more on the Confucian side, in that I don't really think a kind of real anarchist system is going to work. And there's going to have to be some kind of social order. And that might be very different from what we have, that kind of thing. But that's so there's going to have to be some kind of social order and some kind of supports for it. And so I think I would, if I'm just really being honest with my own opinions, I would say there's a need for a constant Zhuangzian critique of that order, pointing out how it's unfair, pointing out how it's distorted, but I think not a rejection of the order. So I think you kind of need both of those sides, would be, I think, just my honest reaction to it. Oh. And I'll just add the last thing, just to emphasize that I do think that if we find ourselves in circumstances where we're doing things that we don't really care about and we can't change that, then caring less might be the reasonable strategy, and I do think a lot of the university administrative work is like that. So I've been on teaching. I feel like that's meaningful. Some administrative work is meaningful, but a lot of it I feel like isn't, and so what are you going to really convince yourself that stuff matters? Like, that doesn't seem good. You could refuse to do it, but that's where something like genuine pretending might be the thing, right? Like, you got to just kind of detach yourself and put yourself in the role and just play the role and not be too invested in the role, Yeah, thanks for those comments. Thanks for all the comments, everybody. I appreciate that.
Okay.
They're really
Sad.
relevant to my own thinking about how this relates to life. I appreciate that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have already run out of time, but fortunately, we are going to have a discussion session very soon, right? So I'm going to invite the hosting fellow, Paul. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Yeah. To make concluding remarks to end this wonderful event.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to say. I mean, Frank, I personally, I think a lot of people really liked it, but personally, I thought it was an amazing talk. That was great.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I by the way, I do agree with, I also sort of agree with that last thing you were saying about the, you have the Mencian system and the Zhuangzi constant critique. I mean, that's sort of how a lot of Chinese scholars for, 2000 years have seen it, right? That you need both, actually, and you need to just operate sort of both as a person in society that way. So, but anyways, I mean, I don't know how to say it in a genuine way, but I really loved the talk. I really liked it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me in. Yeah, thanks everybody for your comments.
Yeah. All right, so if anyone's interested in the discussion session next week, it's just anyone who wants to come. I put the link in, and otherwise, thanks again, Frank, and thanks everyone for participating.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, it was good seeing you. A lot of you that I haven't seen in a long time. I hope maybe the next East West Philosophers Conference, which is a little more than a year away, I think, but maybe sometime before that. Anyway, see you all later.
Yeah, good to see you, Frank.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for the lecture. Bye bye.